Welcome back to the General Tire Jim Beaver Show, powered by Vision Wheel. Got a guy I've known for a long time, never really caught up though, Dan Kahn, and I know Kahn Meat has done a lot for me over the years. I was just out with Optima Batteries at King of the Hammers, courtesy of an invite from you guys. But man, welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks for having me on, Jim. It's great.
Well, we've got a lot to go over here because we've got industry stuff. You've got a book that we're going to talk about. We've got a lot going on, but I guess give us your background, because a lot of people that are listening to the show at some point have probably heard of Kahn Media. You guys in the automotive industry, really, honestly, in the last 5, 6, 7 years have really just skyrocketed, got your hands involved in quite a few things, but you kind of got your background in journalism, correct?
Yeah, you're right on. So I lifelong enthusiast, car guy, outdoors guy. Like a lot of us, I think I grew up in a family, so I sort of didn't have a choice. It was grandpa was a car guy, dad was a car guy. My first vehicle was a '80 Chevy long bed that we bought. I think we actually got it for free. Either got it for free or got it for $200, but it was a diesel and it had a blown up motor. And my dad's neighbor had a jet boat tuning company, and those old '80s jet boats all had 455 Oldsmobiles in it. Yeah. So he was going to put a big block in it. So we took out the 455 Olds and put it in my long bed, and that was my first vehicle. And then restored a Mustang Fastback with my dad. And to be honest, when I was a teenager, just worked really hard and worked at a speed shop to buy parts on layaway and restored this car. And when it was done, I learned to read with car magazines, with Four Wheel and Off Road and Hot Rod and all those. And
funny, same here.
Yeah, I was constantly getting in trouble at school because I was bringing car magazines to school and not doing my work. And I was a crappy student, unless I really liked it. So shop class and English class I liked. Everything else I could care less about. And literally just was like, hey, I want my car in these magazines. And there's something about being young enough and naive enough that you don't know that something isn't possible. And I think an adult would say that's a weird goal back when the car magazines were everywhere. I want my car a bunch of covers. You're 16. That's not a thing. No one told me that. So I just took a bunch of pictures and wrote an article. I didn't understand that people got paid to write articles. So I thought if I wrote the article and I wrote the pictures, they'd put my car in the magazine. And then I bundled it all up and sent them to all the car magazines and said, hey, here's this article I wrote about my own car with these photos I took with an Instamatic camera on the lawn, again, not knowing that it sucked. And I guess maybe I charmed these guys or something, because a bunch of them wrote back, and I ended up my car got on the cover of Hot Rod, Carcraft, and Mustang and Fords in the same year. And wow. Yeah, and partly maybe geography, because I grew up in Southern California within an hour of most of the major publishing companies at the time. So that definitely didn't hurt. And I was like, whoa. And I didn't even know that was a job. And once I started to meet those guys and took my car on photo shoots and met editors and journalists, I went, well, you can get paid to just hang out at car events and write about cars. That's great. I'll do that. And so that became my life goal. And a lot of gracious guys in our industry, some of whom I still work with today, kind of said, hey, by the way, this is a terrible plan. Don't do this. You're going to work really hard and make no money, and it's not stable, and you're going to get fired a lot. It's a bad plan. Don't do it. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. So kind of just got a journalism degree, worked my way through college, writing for magazines, a lot of racing, a lot of kart racing stuff. And then came out and worked in publishing for a few years. And to be honest, I accomplished my life goal very early. At 22, I had a job at Peterson Publishing and was working with all these legendary editors. And I'm like, hey, this is exactly what I wanted. I could do this for the rest of my life. And a whole bunch of stuff happened in fairly short order. First of all, the internet gutted that industry. And it was very clear within a year or two of my taking that job that, oh, the world is about to change. And I'm sitting in staff meetings as the youngest guy in the room going this internet thing is a big deal. Why aren't we talking about it? And they're dismissing it out of hand. They're just nope, that's a fad. Magazines are magazines. Nobody wants to read about cars on the internet. I'm going I don't know. It doesn't sound right. And at the same time, the private equity thing happened, where all of a sudden, Mr. Peterson, who owned Peterson Publishing, wanted to retire. He sells his company. It gets rolled up and sold, and then rolled up and sold again. And I think I went through 3 roll-ups in 2 years. And then they decided to sell the office building that we were sitting in. And they said, hey, now you have to commute, 2 hours each way every day to work. and it just wasn't cool anymore. And I went like, this whole thing is not what I signed up for. Did a couple, years at an online startup and helped launch an online automotive platform, learned about that, jumped into PR and worked for a small motorsports agency, loved it, would have happily stayed there for years. And a headhunter called and said, hey, a bigger agency needs an account lead on enthusiast accounts. At the time it was like McGuire's and Aston Martin and some other stuff, OEs and aftermarket both. Made the jump and suddenly had a lot more responsibility and learned a lot more. And the same kind of thing happened, where at that point social was exploding. And I kind of thought, man, if our goal is connecting brands with consumers, we can help them do that through social and through content and through storytelling. It doesn't have to be through the lens of PR.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a business plan for the agency I worked at and presented it to the owner and said, this is going to transform our business. We can future-proof this thing right now. Let's do it. And out of respect, good guy, built a good business, was sort of a legend in the industry at the time, just didn't see it. And he's like, I think he gave me a week. And afterwards he came back to me a week later. And it's like, nah, this whole like social media thing is stupid. Like, let's just stick to pitching magazines. And at that point I was like a dog with a bone. I couldn't let it go. So I left and started my firm. And that was 16 and a half years ago. So that was Kahn Media.
Yeah. Wow. It's, I don't know. It's funny because there was that shift, and I almost was thinking, I kind of started what I was doing in 2011, and kind of same thing. I grew up, and me, it was just a quest to find money for racing. So, I mean, I was 18, 19, and I was writing up these 15-page proposals with, in a 3-ring binder and mailing them off and going and, and stuff like that. But it's like, I almost feel like we've had that shift to digital and, and now we're having this shift. Like right now, I've never seen shifts of this magnitude, but right now the shift to AI, and I'm just looking at it and it's like, God, how fast can you keep up? Because some of the stuff that's getting cranked out with AI, and I'm going, every once in a while there's these massive shifts, and it's like in the last 12 months this AI stuff is just blown up, and I'm trying to study as much as I possibly can, and it's like I still feel like I can't catch up.
No, I agree, and it's interesting because I think of these shifts like mile markers. And for a while, those mile markers were pretty spread far apart, like when, especially like if you look at the performance aftermarket, all the brands whose logos are behind you, right? Like, Robert E. Peterson started Hot Rod and then Motor Trend and then, Four Wheel and Off Road and, Carcraft. I mean, that was all in the late 40s, early 50s, going into the early 60s. If you were a performance parts company or anything in the aftermarket, a tire company, a wheel company, whatever, for like a good 30 or 40 years, your whole marketing plan was really like, I'm going to meet with a publisher at one of the big publishing houses. I'm going to buy an ad schedule. As a result of buying that ad schedule, I'm going to get access to editorial coverage. I'm going to get access to new product releases in the magazines. I'll sign up for a bunch of events. Some will be trade, some are consumer, and you're done. Like you can do your whole marketing plan for the year in a week. It like really wasn't that hard of a lift. And then like, all of a sudden, because like back then, like our industry, like we weren't doing a lot of like TV. TV was not affordable when it was just broadcast. Well, then cable comes along and Speed Vision comes along. And now all of a sudden maybe you can do TV. And then, the internet comes along and social comes along. And now all of a sudden you have a portal where like, if you're savvy enough and want to spend time, you can buy ads all day long for nothing. Like it's cheap. So all these barriers the mileposts are coming faster and faster and faster to the point we're at now, like you're saying, where it's become a blur. And that's where, I see both a lot of opportunity and some challenges, as an agency, we're now perpetually reinventing ourselves where our kind of the through line model from 2008 to now is connecting brands and consumers through storytelling.
Whatever you do, General Tire delivers.
modality to change every 4 or 5 years. Now it changes every 6 months. And as long as we're telling an authentic story about a brand to a core group of enthusiasts who will help us spread the word, I don't really care if it's on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or through DM ads or through organic or through organic influencers or paid influencer or rev share deals. Like, the way we deliver the message has become secondary to the importance of the message, because it's all I mean, there was a moment there where it's like, oh, TikTok's going away. Let's stop worrying about that. Just kidding. Now it's not going. Like, if you worry about the platform, you're just going to get completely distracted. So I tell my team, like, don't worry about that. That's secondary. The primary thing is just tell a great story.
And I agree. It's, well, you talk about the changes, and I do some public speaking and things. And I've always said, I call it the adapt or die mentality, because I deal with some brands, and some of them are older, and they want to do things the way they were doing 10, 12, 15 years ago. And it's like, you just can't do that. But, talking about the message, it's like, I hear so many people worrying about algorithms and this is how you get traction. And I'm like, but you look at some of the garbage that's going up on Instagram and TikTok, and I know how to get clicks, you know how to get clicks, but it's not doing the brands justice to create content that way. And so I agree with you, you know what I mean, where it's the brand message. If you've got a solid brand message, the rest can all fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a perfect example of that is like, perfect example. We're talking on the Tuesday after President's Day. Daytona 500 was this weekend. Yep. Full disclosure, I am a motorsports fan. I'm not a huge NASCAR guy. But, Cletus McFarland shows up for the Daytona 500 and then wrecked, didn't even race. But the thing is, Garrett is all over the place, right? He's wearing the Ricky Bobby fire suit. He gave a hilarious post-racer, post-crash interview. He was totally on brand. To me, that was the biggest win of the Daytona 500. Yeah. And it was a guy that never actually even really competed in the Daytona 500. He just showed up and was having a good time and being himself and being totally on brand for the whole Cletus thing. And I'm like, this guy's going to save NASCAR. Like, I'm watching this and I'm like, this is what people actually want to see. It's entertaining. It's fun. He was true to himself. His audience loved it. A bunch of people who don't know who he is were on social going like, what's happening? Like, who is this guy? And why is he wearing a Wonder Bread fire suit and what's going on? That to me is the perfect example of just being your authentic self and just tell a story and be entertaining. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter he could have won and probably gotten less attention than he got wrecking.
That's the thing. Like Jimmy Johnson, legend, had an amazing race. Nobody's talking about it. They're talking about Cletus.
Right. 100%. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for brands and for people and for drivers where, like, again, like, you don't have to win, just have a good time and show up and be really transparent with your audience about who you are and what you're trying to do. And they're probably going to love you more for it.
So tell us a little bit about your book, New Rules, the New Rules of the Road, right? Tell us a little bit about this book, because I know you're excited about it. You got it. Yes,
I got a copy. Right, here it is. Yeah, I'll hold it right there. Yeah, The New Rules of the Road, how to navigate the rapidly changing marketing landscape. So like I was saying earlier, way back in 07, 08, I was in an MBA program with my wife. She worked in corporate America. Her MBA was being paid for. Mine, I was trying to self-fund. And so she was like, oh, I get to do this thing, after hours, and my company's paying for it. And if I graduate, they give me a raise. So she had a great motivator. I was just kind of doing it to try and figure stuff out. I really didn't love the classes because I had a bunch of people teaching theoretical business ideas who clearly had never worked in a small business. And to be honest, I'm not a great student. And so I dropped out because I was funding it myself. And I'm like, this isn't for me. So what I did at night while she was getting her degree, her second degree, is I said, I'm going to build my own sort of marketing MBA. And I started reading all these books. And at the time, books like The Purple Cow from Seth Godin was like really transformative for me. And there were some other books. And a guy named David Meerman Scott wrote a book about, and it was an ungated ebook that he wrote. And this is back when you had to like find a server and download it. And he really was the first person I'd ever read that talked about and his was specifically about PR. And it was like, hey, at the dawn of the social media age, PR is going to completely change what it used to be. here's how it works, and here's sort of some stories to explain it in context, and then a path to go forward. And almost 17 years later, I around, and it kind of occurred to me that that doesn't exist for our current moment right now. You know, I don't even know if somebody who did PR 20 years ago would recognize what we do for a living right now. And it's so much less about, like, you know, pitching print editors on stories, and it's more about lining up experiences and connecting with, you know, people like you and, you know, podcasters and content creators, and everything's become decentralized. And in a decentralized market, whether you're a racer or a small business owner or a CMO of a Fortune 500 company, the entire model has completely been disrupted by independent media, including, by the way, the last presidential election. And to me, that was the biggest sign that, like, okay, like, we're here. Like, at this point, when one side has Oprah and CNN and the other side has a bunch of podcasters and wins, regardless of who you voted for, that is a pretty clear sign that the market has changed. So the idea behind the book was to really create something relatable to people who are not marketers. So you do not need a business degree. You don't need a marketing degree. And it tells kind of the story of those mile markers we were talking about earlier, of like, here's where we came from. Here's what PR and marketing started as 100 years ago. And here's where we are today. And gives some pretty clear-cut examples of, here's examples of people who manage this new landscape working with independent creators in a really positive way and grew their brand. And here's some examples of ones that maybe didn't go as planned, and let's dissect what happened. And then each chapter ends with sort of a checklist, so you can get clear takeaways of, okay, as I come, you know, out of this book with my own thoughts and my own brand and my own project, here's how I move forward. Here's how I build a plan. And whether you have a huge budget or no budget, here's how you can figure out a way to kind of push your brand story out to as many people as possible, who will then help you share your message for you.
It's pretty, well, it's, you know, it's funny. There's so many takeaways from here, but I laugh because you talked about, you know, the changing landscape of marketing and things like that. And I don't want to age myself, but when I got my college degree in business and marketing, I mean, social media didn't even exist. You know, I mean, maybe MySpace, but I think back, and like the entire premise of my college degree was television, radio, you know, it was, you know, print ads, maybe a little bit of banner ads at the time, you know, and things like that. But I'm going, man, it's the changing landscape. And I think, you know, that's one of the, you know, I'm excited to read your book, just because I think, you know, there's a lot of people now, whether you're a small business, there's a lot of people that don't have marketing degrees that really are in over their head, and they don't have even slightest idea of, you know, what direction to go. So I think it's pretty awesome. You know, I can't wait to read the book, because it seems like it's something for everybody.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and it's available on Amazon. In fact, we found out on Thursday that it's now an Amazon bestseller, which is cool. Awesome. And yeah, and you're right. And you know, I heard an analogy years ago, and I can't let it go because it's so accurate. Where a friend made this analogy where who was a marketer, and he said, you know, what we used to do to fill our bucket was we would just turn on a fire hose, and it filled the bucket pretty quick. And the fire hose doesn't exist anymore. So now we need 30 garden hoses that are all on drip. And you know what? The bucket still fills up, but you know, the good news is there's a lot of redundancy there. And if a couple of those tactics don't work, it's okay. You still have lots of other garden hoses on drip. The hard part is you have to manage 30 garden hoses, and that's a lot of work. And so, you know, I do think there is more access and opportunity for people than ever before. Because, I mean, I remember when I started my career out, if you wanted to get a story in a major media outlet, that was a pretty hard thing to do for a normal person who didn't work in the business. Like, I mean, to really date myself, the first PR agency I worked for, our database of media contacts was in print. Like, they didn't have an online database yet. It was an actual book called the Bacon's book. And like, you'd have to like look it up, and it was huge. It was like $5,000, and you'd have to buy it once a year, and they'd ship you this huge thing. And then I remember a year or two in, we moved to an online database, which made it a lot easier. But without that, and without like an email address from a known entity, you had no access. That's not the case anymore. You can slide into someone's DMs and say, hey, I've got this product, and I think it's really cool, and I really align with what you're saying and your audience, and I think you'd be a perfect person to work with. So let me send it to you, and you try it. And if you like it, let's have a conversation. Maybe we can do an affiliate deal, and maybe you make a few bucks and I make a few bucks. We'll grow together. those kinds of opportunities didn't exist 10 years ago. So I think there's a huge opportunity for people that are willing to sort of put in the work and really try and kind of figure these opportunities out for themselves. It's just figuring out how to organize it. And then the more important part is, what is it you're trying to say? And whether, like I said, whether you're running your own team or a business or whatever it is, it's really the story you're trying to tell to a really small group of people. Because if you can connect with that small group and get them to believe in you, they're going to tell everybody else for you. And that's, that's the hard part.
Yeah, well, I think the digital age, like you said, it's sliding into DMs. The world has got a lot smaller. There used to be these people that were unobtainable, and now it's really easy to get a hold of somebody if you try hard enough. It's not too bad. But I want to go back to the fire hose analogy, and then in the drip system, it's funny because I've kind of coached a lot of race car drivers and things like that, and everybody wants to go. If you need $200,000 to race, they all want to go to every single company. I need 200 grand. I need 200 grand.
Right.
I need 200 grand. And I go, why don't you go and try and get 8 $25,000 sponsors? And they go, well, what do you mean? And I go, well, if you lose one, you're not out of business.
Right.
If you've got one and it's a $200,000 sponsor, you lose them, you're done. And so it's funny because I think there's a lot of things that the drip analogy and 30 garden hoses, it really hits home with me because that's just the way things have moved. And I think that big dollar cash cow whale is a whole lot harder to land now than it was, years ago.
Well, you're right. And I think on the opposite side of that, the big brands that write the big checks are also starting to realize that there's way more powerful ways to tell their story and connect with potential consumers than just writing giant checks. And so now they're figuring that out, right? So like, yes, obviously there's still people who are buying Super Bowl ads and they're, putting blimps in the air and doing all that stuff. And sure, of course, that there is a value to that at some level. But a lot of them more, like if you look at some of the, like one of the case studies in the book I talk about, is I'm sure anyone who knows a 20-something-year-old woman is aware of Stanley cups, right? Like Stanley was like my grandpa's like canteen brand from like the old days. And I don't think I remember even seeing anything like a Stanley lunchbox for years. And all of a sudden you blink and they're everywhere, right? Like they're just everywhere. They're on every, go to any office in America for a couple of years there. And there's a bunch of, and it's interesting because that was a demo they identified as, hey, we're going to go after a very specific demo. It was not their typical demo. It wasn't construction workers going to a job site. It wasn't some camper. It was mostly young women. It became like this like status symbol thing. And then one of the ways they achieved that and they locked it in cost them almost nothing. And I thought it was such a brilliant masterstroke in marketing. We've had a lot of fires out here in California, and one of the fires from a couple of years ago came through and it burned this young lady's car, and her car burned, and she put a TikTok. And this was somebody like a regular person. She wasn't like an influencer. She had a couple thousand followers on TikTok, but she took a video as she walked up to her like burned Volkswagen and said, hey, this is crazy. Check it out. And her car's toast, is completely torched. And she opens the door and the interior is all burned. And there's a Stanley sitting in the cup holder and the outside of the Stanley cup's all burned. And she goes like this and shakes it, and you can hear the ice tinkling around inside the cup, and she opens it up and the ice is still cold. And she puts it up. Well, the video goes viral. It gets a ton of traction. It gets hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. In fact, it got millions of views. And what they did that I thought was so brilliant is the CMO of the company sees the video and within 24 hours creates a response and posts it on their official channel. And he literally just jumps on there from his office. It's low production, vertical format video. They didn't bring in some big crew. It was clearly somebody with a phone. He's like, hey, we saw your video. Thank you for being a customer. Most importantly, we're glad you're okay. And, things can be replaced. People can't. So we're glad you're safe. We appreciate you sharing your story. So not only we can obviously replace your cup, we're also going to replace your car. So we're going to buy your brand new Volkswagen to replace the one you lost in the fire. And that video went viral. And then a week or two later, she posts another video of her taking delivery of her new car and doing like the Thanks Stanley thing. To me, like, okay, so for the cost of a new Volkswagen, so what are we talking about? Maybe like 35, 38 grand, something like that out the door. They ended up getting like 9 million video views of the last video. I think collectively across all of them, it was like 20 million views, huge impressions, crazy positive vibes coming out of that. And that's how they did what they did, was things like that, where they didn't buy a bunch of ads on TV. They didn't buy a bunch of, billboards on some major highway. They did something in a very authentic way that made people feel really good about supporting their brand. And I think anytime anyone can do that, even in motorsports and racing, like I said, like that's the Cletus thing. I felt good watching that interview just because I like his videos. I think he's kind of silly. I like that he was kind of camping it up and having a good time and doing the whole Ricky Bobby thing. And I'm like, this is fun. This is way more fun than just watching the regular Daytona 500 for me. So if you can make people feel something, you're gonna do okay.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because what is it? I think they've got like the kids version of the Super Bowl that they'll air, and it's like on Nickelodeon or one of the, I don't know if it's Disney, whatever. But we've tuned in and watched parts of that. It's actually more fun than the actual NFL game, like watching the Super Bowl. And people are like, what do you mean? And I'm like, no, because they're having fun with it. And they're dumbing it down to kids, but it's like, it's hilarious. They're like, oh, and there's Taylor's boyfriend who just, went for 15. And like, we're watching it. I'm going, man, they should take bits of this and infuse it into the actual television broadcast, because, it's not as serious, but it's the same, they're getting the same point across.
100%. No, I agree. And I think, that is one of the lessons I've taken away from motorsports media the last couple of years. Is it seems like where things have started to grow again. Obviously, for a moment there when I was a younger man, there was a lot of motorsports on TV, and you can kind of get everywhere. And then things became sort of a desert for a bit, and now it's coming back, and I think that's awesome. And I think part of it is they're just turning it into entertainment. And if you want to be hardcore and get into stats and do all that, you can do that. If you just want to be entertained, you can do that too. And that's, for the consumer, that's good. And if the consumer is benefiting from it, then the teams will, and the brands will, and the sponsors will, and then everybody's happier.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a reason why, Monster Jam is probably one of the watch motorsports on the planet. Their reruns, I've seen like the ratings on TV, because you flip through the channels and it can be 11 o'clock at night on a Monster Jam rerun that's 6 months old, but you stop because here's a truck 3 stories in the air doing flips, and it's just it's fun, and I think
it's WWE. It's just entertainment. But I mean, even like, we were a couple of friends and mentors started Moto America, like, oh man, like 10 years ago, when Richard Varner bought, AMA Superbike Racing, essentially from the France family. And we were involved in the early days. We don't work with them anymore, but we did all their brand work and came up with the name and the logo and all that. And it's fun for me because for a while they were very focused on just like traditional motorcycle road racing. And then when the baggers thing came about, I'll admit, I was also like, and Terry Cargis, one of the partners who's a close friend, was like, yeah, we're going to do this thing called King of the Baggers. And I'm like, why? Like V-twin baggers on the road course. Like, I don't get it. And he's like, no, it's going to be cool. And man, has that thing taken off. And again, because it's entertaining and it's sort of weird and it's sort of different.
I've seen the TV ratings for King of the Baggers, and it rivals, I mean, the super bikes. It's wild. I mean,
it's
people
huge.
love it.
Yeah. And the brands are all behind it, and you've got Indian and Harley, and they all want in. And I mean, like it's because again, it's just fun. I think people at the end of the day, they want to be entertained, and they have so many options now where, like you said, I mean, you can watch the kids version of the Super Bowl. You can watch the Puppy Bowl. You can watch the regular Super Bowl. Like, or you could say, screw it, and just go on YouTube and watch a bunch of other random stuff down some rabbit hole that you're interested in. Like, so people have so many options. You've got to make it fun. If they're not having a good time, they're not going to do it. That is something I think, and we're pretty closely aligned with King of the Hammers, and we've done their marketing and PR for a while. And that is one thing I'd say they do really, really well, is the live stream is really good, and they make it as accessible as they can. So that's one of the things about off-road racing that I think is actually improving. And I'm curious to get your take on it, Jim. But I think just the, between drones and streaming technology, a motorsport that used to be kind of hard to watch as a spectator has become a lot more accessible. And I think that's been pretty cool.
Well, I think, I call it the big three when you talk about, and I'm going to ignore Mexico, but just domestically here in the States, like you look at the three events that absolutely kill it. You've got King of the Hammers, you've got the Mid 400 in Las Vegas, and you've got Crandon up in Wisconsin. That's Labor Day weekend. And you look at the parallels, and yeah, there's racing going on, but I know a lot of people who go to all three and never watch a race. Because it's a good time. It's a festival. There's music, there's brands, there's things to do, there's activations, and I think you look at those three and you can almost look at how they run those events, and they almost mirror each other.
Yep. No, you're right. And it's about entertainment. It's about giving people a good time.
Yeah. There just happens to be a race going on in the background. I hate to say that.
No,
but,
yeah, you're right.
But no, I agree. King of the Hammers, what they've done, I mean, they caught lightning in the bottle. And it's funny because that event, you look at the Min 400, been around for 50 years. You look at Crandon, been around for 50 something years. You look at the King of the Hammers, I mean, we're a little over a decade in with that one. And I go, man, that's lightning in a bottle they caught, and it's really, really amazing.
Yeah. And I also think it's kind of amazing that it even happens, because this is an event that's happening in California of all places, which is not historically super friendly to internal combustion motorsports. And this is the most internal combustion motorsport on the planet. And it's out on public land, and it's a big racetrack, and there's a lot of people out on that desert, and to be totally candid, the first we worked with Dave and the Hammers guys was all the way back in 21. So the race happened in 2020 before the COVID thing happened. And then the COVID thing happened, and California was still hardcore lockdown in January of 21. And they brought us in as like crisis comms to say, hey, we're not sure what's going to happen with the state. We're not going to sure, all this craziness, all this stuff going on in the world at that time. Can you help us navigate it? And we said, yeah. And I have to be honest, like both the BLM on the federal side, Bureau of Land Management, and even the governor's office. And I'm not historically a huge fan of a lot of decisions that get made up there. Everybody was cool. Like they said, hey, we get it. This is a major economic engine for the area. This supports the entire county. There's people coming in for this thing from all over the country. We want it to happen. And let's all work together to make sure the race happens. And that made me feel really good, because it's like they still see motorsports as a real positive for the community, which it is. So that was cool.
Yeah, well, that's funny because I had my motorhome out at Hammers that year for 10 days, but that was one of those, all of us going, Dave and everybody said, no, Hammers is happening. And all of us scratching our head going, I hope it happens, but I don't see this happening. Somehow it did. And I think the entire industry was blown away, because there's no way California is going to allow this to happen. And it happened. And it was great. It was an awesome event. Yeah.
And credit to Dave for that one, because same. We were on payroll going dude, there's no way they're going to let this happen. And they did. We're like, all right, cool. And I think it was the first motorsport event live in person in the country. So pretty neat with an audience anyway.
Yeah. So question for you before we let you go. Obviously lots of changes, things like that. What do you see the next 12 to 24 months? I mean, media wise, marketing wise, automotive wise. I mean, man, we haven't even dipped into talking about EVs yet. Obviously we talked about AI a bit, but what do you see our industry in the next 12 to 24 months?
Well, I think we're in an amazing moment right now, Jim. I really do. And I feel blessed that we're getting to live through these times, because if you look back on history, there are kind of these sort of peaks and valleys of things that happen in every industry. And, there is certainly, as you mentioned earlier with AI and everything else, there is a lot of change happening, and we're living through this pivot right now, both with automotive and media. So I think that there's a lot that's happening right now that's interesting. Like I said earlier, I think the shift to independent media is already well underway, and I think that's going to continue. And one of the things I'm really happy about is enthusiast media, whether it's racing or off-road or muscle cars or hot rods or whatever you're into, imports, drift, doesn't matter. Those were sort of, they were kind of behind gatekeepers for a long time, right? Well, those gatekeepers have disappeared, right? They're gone. And then we went through this little period that we're kind of at the tail end of now, which was sort of the Wild West, where everyone's trying something different. And some people are just creating a whole bunch of content and putting it out there. And like there's podcasters out there saying, I'm going to create a new show every single day. I'm going to put out 5 episodes a week. There's some people that are saying, I'm going to produce cinema quality video and put it up on YouTube once a month. Like nobody really knows what the secret sauce is. Everyone's trying something different. And I think we're approaching a moment now where there's only so many platforms and channels people are willing to monitor, right? Like I'm not willing to look at, I think at one point in my house, we cut the cable about 6-7 years ago. And at one point I was paying for 6 or 7 streaming services. Well, after a while I realized like I'm spending more money on this than I was spending on cable. And I also don't watch half these channels, right? So like, okay, I'm going to cancel this one. I'm going to cancel this one. And then you end up with like the 2 or 3. So I think that's kind of consumer behavior in general. So I think people are starting to settle into a groove. And if you're a podcast person like you and I are, like I really like podcasts.
The Rigid Chase Lite incorporates 5 modes, including stroll, brake, running, courtesy, and reverse in a compact 7-inch by 2-inch fixture. The Rigid Chase attaches to any roll bar or flat mounting surface, and users can control each of the multiple functions independently. The Rigid Chase is one more way for off-road enthusiasts to own the night.
I think whether it's Instagram wins the war, TikTok wins the war, I think that people are going to start settling into grooves. Brands are going to start kind of focusing on what aligns with their values. And then if you're an enthusiast, you can kind of choose. You can say, I really like audio. I really like video. I like long form video, short form video. Some people like listening to 3-hour super nuanced conversations. Some people want all their information packed into a 5-minute little mini episode. So brands are going to be able to choose how they want to connect on the automotive side. I'm hopeful that that's going the same way, because things got a little scary there for a minute because the government starts mandating, what you can buy and where you can buy it. And hey, we're going to outlaw internal combustion. We're going to do all this stuff. And, as a proponent of, things that go fast and make a lot of noise, I wasn't loving the direction that was all going. And I think the election has changed that course. And I actually just read a release over the weekend that SEMA is putting out that we're helping them with, that the government, the feds are actually going after the whole CARB, no internal combustion after 2030 rule. So I think they're going to hopefully try and get that shut down and then let free market capitalism do its thing. And I think honestly, there's people out there where I think EVs are a great choice. If you live in a city, buy an EV, that's cool. Like do you, and if you live out in the country or you live in a place where it's 20 below zero 3 or 4 months a year, and the closest charging station is 50 miles away, an EV is probably not your best bet. Or you have to tow something for a living, an EV is probably not your best bet. At that point, go buy a diesel Super Duty or something. So, I'm hopeful that I think the free market will probably continue. And as a result, our industry will continue to thrive. Because one thing I know about car guys is, it was only maybe 6 months after Tesla came out with the first Model S that companies started popping up at SEMA selling suspension kits and wheel and tire kits, and they're hacking the ECU to try and unlock plaid mode. And our guys are going to do what they do. And I think as long as, there's plenty of platforms for them to tinker with, they're going to figure out how to screw them up and make them go faster and less reliable. And then you and I get to keep doing this for a living.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I think I like that, the kind of the freedom of choice, and I think everything's going to be kind of, I like that idea, kind of more tailor-made to everybody. There's going to be a lot of choices because years back it was, like TV. I grew up, we only had 13 channels in my house, and you were just forced to watch one of the 13, and it was what it was, now obviously, like you said, with streaming and everything else, it's so tailor-made. And I think that's the interesting part where, obviously you've got events like the Super Bowl or the Daytona 500, they're going to bring in juggernaut ratings. But outside of those big events, you can't, 7 p.m. on a Wednesday night when there was only 3 choices, you knew the ratings were going to be good. Now, people have a lot of options. So I think it's creating this interesting ecosystem of content, and it's causing everybody to up their game, because there's a lot of different options for people to tune into. It's not just those 3 channels at 7 o'clock at night.
No, exactly. And honestly, you can go back and watch a race from 20 years ago on YouTube if you want to. Yeah. And so, there's infinite options. So it's forcing everybody to come up with something more compelling. And even with the new vehicle stuff, I mean, to be honest, I've had some conversations as of late where people are like, oh, well, back in the good old days of performance. And I'm like, dude, you can go to a showroom right now and you can buy a Ram with a Hellcat motor. You can buy a blown V8 Raptor. You can buy a Corvette that makes 1,000 horsepower. Like, things are pretty good right now. Like, I know that there's a lot of talk about EVs, but there's some pretty crazy stuff out there if you're into it.
Yeah, well, my dad's got a Ford dealership, and and he gets customers in all the time. That 7.3 diesel was the best diesel that was ever made, and Ford made a mistake by getting rid of that. And it's still, can you find me a low mileage diesel, 7.3? And my dad's like, you realize they haven't made that in 20 years. And have you driven one of these new ones? Because it'll out drag race a 7.3, all day, any day. It's same thing with the people that 350 Chevy or 351 Ford. Those are the greatest engines ever. And I'm like, have you driven one of these modern EcoBoosts? It'll smoke anything. It's funny because, like you said, people are kind of stuck in the past to an extent, and some of this technology. I'm like, you drive something modern, man, you'll shake your head at some of the stuff in the past.
No, it's true. It's true. But at the same time, I get it also. Like I have a new truck and a new daily driver, but I'm also weirdly obsessed with OBS Chevys, and I've had a lot of them. And I like them because I can work on them myself. If I can buy parts cheap at the local auto parts store, I can fix them in my own garage. I don't need a ton of super crazy code reading equipment. It's, pretty simple hand tools. You can do it yourself. So I get both sides of it, but I also wouldn't want to daily it every day. So there's a shoe for every foot, right?
Yeah, exactly. I love having them around. Like you said, something fun on the weekends, drive it once a week, but you don't want to have it as an everyday driver. I completely understand that. Yeah. Well, Dan, it's been awesome having you on the show. Thanks. Obviously, we'll get the link up for the book in the footnotes of the show, so anybody tuning in can go snag a copy of that off Amazon. But congrats on everything, and hopefully we see it out at an event sometime soon this year.
Sounds good, Jim. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Dan.